New York Mayor Bill de Blasio may have to contend with the silent anger of the officers who have turned their backs in protests. But he still had it easier than what one of his predecessors faced when the police wanted to send him a message. This was the scene on September 16, 1992, when more than 10,000 off-duty police officers and their supporters descended upon New York City's City Hall in a protest against Mayor David Dinkins. New York Times story gave this description of the scene that day. A handful of people, then hundreds, then thousands, broke through barricades and surged onto City Hall steps. From there, the protest degenerated into a beer-swilling, traffic-snarling, epitaph-hurling melee that stretched from the Brooklyn Bridge to Murray Street, where several politicians helped stoke the emotional fires. The protest would have been noteworthy even if it had been any rally gone a bit too wild, but the protesters were the police. The officers were protesting Dinkins' response to a number of police issues, including a proposal to create a civilian board to investigate police misconduct, and his visit to the family of a Dominican immigrant who was killed by an officer in a confrontation that sparked unrest in the Washington Heights section of New York. Khalil, those images, that reminder of 1992, which is now much longer ago than I'd like to remember and admit, it made us pause and kind of look through some of the history. On the one hand, it is much safer to be a police officer in the modern era than it has been before. If you look at 64 to 2014, there is an overall, what we call kind of a secular decline in police officer deaths, although there's kind of a spike in 2001. But most recently, in 2014, you do see an increase of 24% in the deaths of police officers. 56% of them fatalities, or 56% of those deaths, this kind of spike by firearm deaths, which makes me wonder, is the thing that's really dangerous here the number of guns that are available on the streets?
Well, sure. We have a gun culture that is the third rail of American politics. So to the extent that police officers should be the largest anti-gun lobby in America, taking on the NRA directly rather than mayors of cities that are trying to govern all the people and trying to establish that every individual has a right to be fear of state violence, is the elephant in this conversation. The Dinkins situation, though, I think is also telling, because partly what you see there is a reflection of a culture of white male privilege. And I don't want to get stuck on the privilege question, but I do want to come back to this, that they represent working class American history.
Yeah, and the police force does not look like that. I mean, as Amy was pointing out in the last hour, the images we're seeing right now, that's 1992 New York Police Department. And as a result of these social movements and the protests, as you've talked about, the department does not look like that anymore.
But my point is that, and this is exactly the point, that we have been caught in a loop for the past 20 years where racial representation stands in as fundamental change. So that the fact that the force is blacker or browner or yellower has not changed the culture of policing and the system that puts it in place. So the trade-off for officers, and I can tell you this from personal experience, I have lectured at John Jay as a guest lecturer. I have stood before rooms of graduate students and undergraduates, current officers and soon-to-be officers, who refer to the people in the communities they police as perps, as people deserving of excessive force, of people deserving of guilt until proven innocent. In other words, these are young black and brown people being professionalized in a college, and yet they have already moved to the other side because the price of admission, the price of the ticket to participation on that force is to accept that those people do not have the same right to exist in these communities.
Officer Claxton, I feel like I got to let you in on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because what oftentimes occurs is that the blacks or Latinos who are integrated into the police departments become subsumed by the police culture as opposed to their own culture or their experiences. So what you find is that regardless of the complexion of the individual officer, if they are following a certain procedure, if they are following a certain law enforcement or enforcement trend, you will have the same result. It is important that people relate to those individuals who serve as police officers. It is also important that police officers are empathetic to those who they serve. It's just basic customer service. But changing the complexion of these departments without the necessary reforms will be disappointing to
Officer
many
Claxton,
people who are pushing for justice reform.
I've got to hold you off for a second because we want to take you now live to Brooklyn, where New York Mayor Bill de Blasio is speaking at the funeral for slain police officer